They thought they were just arresting another guy who fit the description. But when he showed up in court the next day, not in cuffs but in a suit, they realized they'd made the worst mistake of their careers. It was just after 9 a.m. when the call came through dispatch. Black male, mid-30s, navy jacket, suspected in a vehicle break-in on Madison Avenue. Officers Brent Halcroft and Lynn Mercer were already cruising down the block in their patrol car, sipping coffee, half listening. They glanced at each other like it was a joke. "There he is," Brent muttered, pointing with his chin toward a man standing outside Grange Bakehouse, one of the busiest cafes in downtown Boise. The man looked calm, focused, flipping through something on his phone, a croissant bag in one hand. He matched the description loosely. That was enough for them. Brent parked fast. No warning lights, no sirens. Lynn was already out of the vehicle before the tires stopped rolling. She shouted, "Hey! Hands where I can see them!" The man, Kenton Miro, looked up, startled, but not panicked. "Excuse me? You fit the description of a suspect. Don't move," Brent added, stepping closer with his hand near his holster. "I'm standing outside a bakery," Kenton replied, puzzled. "Waiting for my driver." Lynn rolled her eyes. "We'll clear it up at the station." Kenton barely had time to respond. Brent grabbed his arm and spun him around. "You're resisting now?" he said, loud enough for bystanders to hear. The crowd started watching. Phones came out. Kenton didn't resist. He said nothing more. He looked down at the sidewalk as they tightened the cuffs on his wrists. Lynn smirked. Funny how they always get mouthy until they see the cuffs. Probably another guy with a fake LinkedIn page and some story about his credentials, Brent added, laughing. They didn't read him his rights. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't check his phone or the shopping bag that clearly had a receipt inside. They just shoved him into the back of the patrol car and pulled away, already joking about the report they'd have to file later. Inside the cruiser, Kenton stared straight ahead, silent. "You got anything to say?" Brent said over his shoulder. Kenton's voice was calm. "I want my phone call." Brent made a face. "You'll get it, after booking." But something in Kenton's tone, measured, patient, almost indifferent, put a crack in their confidence. Not enough to stop them, just enough to make Brent look back again through the mirror. Kenton wasn't scared. He wasn't rattled. And he wasn't done. At the precinct, booking was slow. The desk officer, a guy named Rob Tesh, blinked twice when he saw the man being walked in. Guys, you sure about this one?" Brent waved him off. "Fits the call. Car break-in. He was loitering." "He was standing outside a bakery with a pastry bag and a phone," Kenton said quietly. Lynn stepped in. "Are you doubting a field call, Tesh?" Rob frowned, hesitated, then took Kenton's info. He looked at the screen, then did a double take. "This address." "I'd like my call now," Kenton said again, gently interrupting. Brent raised his eyebrows. "Who you gonna call? Lawyer buddy?" "No," Kenton said. "The Attorney General's office." Brent laughed, like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. "Sure. Tell him we said hi." They walked away. But Rob Tesh didn't laugh. He was still staring at the screen, and that's when everything started to shift. But what Brent and Lynn couldn't see coming was just how far out of their depth they already were. The holding cell was cold. Not freezing, but that kind of steady cold that sinks into your wrists when you're still cuffed. Kenton sat on the bench, not slouched, not stiff, just steady. He was dressed sharp, even in jeans and a jacket. Polished boots, clean lines. Everything about him said control. Even now, down the hall, Brent leaned against a vending machine, cracking open a soda like it was just another Tuesday. "You see the look on his face?" he said to Lynn. Like he thought he was above it all. Lynn took a sip of her coffee. That type always does. Shows up in the nice part of town, starts acting like rules don't apply. Same script, Brent chuckled. My favorite is when they start talking about lawsuits and badges. Like we haven't heard that one before. Neither of them noticed the man from Internal Affairs walking past the front desk. or the fact that Rob Tesh had stepped away from his post and into a back office, talking on a secured line. Back in the holding area, Kenton was finally granted his call. He didn't fumble for a number, didn't scroll his phone. He simply dialed. "This is Moreau," he said once the line picked up. "Boise PD, Madison Avenue incident. I'll need everything by this afternoon." He hung up. No anger, no noise. Just a clean break. The call lasted under 30 seconds, but that was all it took. Later that afternoon, the precinct's chief received a quiet, direct email from the state's Department of Civil Oversight. A flagged alert. Request for immediate release of detainee, Kenton L. Moreau. Attached were credentials, links, a federal database profile, and a notification of an audit under Article 14 of the State Law Enforcement Integrity Act. It didn't come from a lawyer. It came from the Attorney General's liaison. Within 45 minutes, Kenton was out. When Brent saw him again, it was in the corridor. Not in cuffs, not behind a door, but walking past them calmly, alongside two state officials in suits. Brent blinked like the light changed suddenly. "That's not possible," he muttered. Lynn narrowed her eyes. "What the hell is going on?" Rob Tesh was watching from his desk. He didn't say a word. He just typed something into a system they didn't have access to. Kenton didn't glance back. He didn't throw any looks, didn't smirk. He just left with the same measured walk he came in with. And the silence he left behind was heavier than any siren. That night, Brent had dinner with his brother and ranted about people with connections. Called it favoritism. Said it reeked of politics. Lynn, sitting on her porch with a beer, told her girlfriend it was probably some city hall mix-up and that the guy would still get slapped with a record eventually. Nobody walks around that smooth without hiding something. But as the week went on, the rumors started. Whispers inside the department. Someone mentioned Kenton's name during briefing, and two sergeants exchanged a look. One officer said he used to work in Oakland and was high up in some watchdog group. Even Captain Rolstad started acting different, short with his answers, more careful with his wording when Kenton's name came up. That got Brent nervous. If command was spooked, that meant something real was in play. Lynn brushed it off. "We got body cam. We got the call log. We were following protocol." Brent nodded, but it was forced. His stomach was twisting a bit. Because something about Kenton didn't add up. Not in the way they expected. And the way he left? With no drama. That wasn't how the guilty move. Still, they went back to work like nothing had changed. But the truth was already moving faster than them. Because by the time they felt the floor shifting, Kenton was already standing on higher ground and watching everything. The courthouse in downtown Boise wasn't grand or intimidating. Just concrete steps, glass doors, and the echo of shoes down wide hallways. Brent and Lynn walked in side by side, both dressed sharp, pressed blues, polished badges, no smiles. This was routine. They'd done courtroom appearances more times than they could count. The charge read simple: obstructed investigation of stolen vehicle. They expected Kenton to show up late, probably with a lawyer in tow, maybe try to turn it into a spectacle. But Kenton wasn't outside. He wasn't in the waiting area. He wasn't even on the docket like a typical defendant. As they passed the security checkpoint, a bailiff approached them with a stiff nod. "You two are testifying in courtroom 2C?" Brent answered, "Yeah, Halcroft and Mercer. This the Moreau case?" The bailiff blinked. "Moreau's not the defendant." Brent frowned. "Come again?" The bailiff just pointed. "You'll see." When they stepped into 2C, everything felt wrong. Not chaotic, not loud, just different. The room was full. Not with the usual crowd of nervous defendants and annoyed lawyers. There were journalists, 2 camera crews, someone from the city council. Brent's neck stiffened. Then his eyes locked on the front table. There, seated beside the judge, was Kenton Moreau. No cuffs, no defense attorney, just a man in a dark tailored suit, calmly flipping through a binder. A nameplate in front of him read, Special Counsel for Civil Accountability, State of Idaho. Lynn leaned in. "What is this?" Brent whispered back, "I don't know. This wasn't in the case notes." The judge called the room to order. Today's session concerns a procedural review regarding conduct during a recent arrest on Madison Avenue, she said. Mr. Miro will serve in an advisory capacity representing the state's Civil Accountability Office. Lynn's jaw twitched. Brent looked like he'd been slapped without warning. Kenton didn't look their way. Not once. He simply sat back as the judge turned to the front bench. Officers Halcroft and Mercer, please approach. They moved stiffly, no longer in control. Every eye in the room was on them, but not the kind they were used to. This wasn't admiration, it was scrutiny. The judge asked, "Can you walk us through the reasoning behind your decision to detain Mr. Moreau?" Brent cleared his throat. "We received a dispatch call. Black male, navy jacket. Mr. Moreau had no prior criminal record." The judge interrupted. "No history with your department. Was ID checked before detainment?" Lynn replied, "He fit the description, and he didn't comply when we gave commands." Kenton didn't look up, but he did click his pen once. Slow and deliberate. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Moreau, do you have any clarifying points?" He looked directly at them for the first time. "In my line of work," Kenton began, voice steady, "I've read hundreds of reports that start the same way. Vague descriptions, unchecked assumptions, and over time those patterns tell a story the badge doesn't protect you from." Lynn opened her mouth to interrupt, but Kenton raised a finger, not to her, to the judge. "I'd like to enter a motion to suspend direct testimony today. Internal review has been authorized. A hearing will follow in 2 weeks." The courtroom went still. The judge nodded. "Granted." Brent and Lynn didn't say a word. They stepped back, numb. Kenton gathered his binder, closed it quietly, and stood. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't gloat, but his presence was heavier than any argument they could have made. And when he walked out, the press followed. Brent's hands were shaking. Lynn whispered, "What the hell is happening?" But deep down, both of them already knew. Because that wasn't a courtroom loss. That was the opening move, and Kenton had just flipped the board. Before Boise, before the suit and the title, Kenton Moreau was just another kid trying to keep his head down in Bakersfield, California. His mother, Deidre Moreau, worked night shifts at Mercy Hospital, and his father, when he was around, painted houses and rarely stayed long enough to leave anything but cigarette smoke and silence behind. By 12, Kenton had already learned to navigate 2 worlds, one at school where he aced spelling bees and science fairs, and one outside where he kept his eyes low when patrol cars rolled by. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he watched everything. One day in 8th grade, a teacher accused him of stealing a calculator. No one else was questioned. His locker was searched. Nothing was found. He said nothing then. But he never forgot how easily adults accepted suspicion when it was pointed at him. It wasn't rage that fueled him. It was the pattern. At 17, he earned a scholarship to UC Davis, majored in political science, wrote essays that cut through the noise. He didn't yell. He just laid out the facts. Clean, sharp, precise. In a room full of opinions, he made silence feel like a verdict. Law school followed. Stanford. He got in without connections, without favors, just grit and focus. While others chased corporate firms and paychecks, Kenton interned with a public accountability unit in Alameda County. He sat in hearings where officers described routine stops that ended with broken ribs and bruised wrists. He logged every word. He didn't wear anger like armor. He wore patience like a weapon. By 33, Kenton was leading reviews for the Western District's Office of Civil Conduct. Quietly, case by case, he built a reputation. Not a flashy one, not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that made departments nervous. He moved like a lawyer, thought like an analyst, and carried himself like a man who already knew what you were hiding. Boise was his first appointment as special counsel for civil accountability, a position created after years of lobbying by watchdog groups who were tired of internal affairs cleaning their own house. Kenton was handpicked by the state board, vetted, quietly confirmed, and he kept a low profile on purpose. He didn't tweet, he didn't lecture, he showed up. And that morning outside the bakery? That wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, but it was the first time it happened after his appointment. That mattered. Because for once, he wouldn't have to file a complaint. He was the complaint. He didn't want revenge. That was too small for the work he was doing. He wanted the truth on paper. He wanted patterns exposed. He wanted departments to know they were being watched. And not just from within. After the incident, he didn't call a news outlet. He called a judge. Then he called the Office of Personnel Audits. His badge wasn't brass, it was legislative, and it gave him authority to request files, pull records, and open up cases that had been closed for years. That's why Brent and Lynn were on edge. It wasn't about one arrest. It was about all of them, because Kenton wasn't just some lawyer they cuffed by accident. He was the one person in the state with the clearance and the motive to open their entire record, and he didn't need to raise his voice to do it. The precinct felt different, not louder, not busier, just tense. Brent Halcroft noticed it first when he walked into the break room and conversations stopped. Not the kind of silence that happens when you interrupt a joke. The kind where people don't want to be heard saying the wrong thing. He opened the fridge, grabbed his lunch, and tried to act like he didn't notice. But something was off. Lynn Mercer caught on a few hours later. She passed a conference room and spotted Lieutenant Schaffer speaking in hushed tones with two men in suits. Neither wore department badges. One had a leather folio tucked under his arm, the kind federal guys always seem to carry. She slowed her pace, tried to catch a name. They stopped talking the moment she came into view. That night, Brent got a call from his cousin, also a cop, over in Twin Falls. "Hey, you didn't cuff some guy named Moreau last week, did you?" his cousin asked. Brent's stomach dropped. "Why?" "Because his name's bouncing around like wildfire. State Audit Board, some kind of oversight authority. Whole precinct over here is watching their reports like they're about to get audited next." Brent laughed, but it sounded forced. "Nah, it's fine. Just a misunderstanding. Guy got mouthy. We cleared it." But the lie didn't even feel convincing to him anymore. 2 days later, the captain called them in. Not a casual meeting, not a swing by my office moment. Formal request, full uniform, paper trail. They stepped inside the captain's office and saw the same two suits from the hallway sitting across from his desk. "Officers Halcroft, Mercer," Captain Rolstad began, his voice clipped. "This is Mr. Granger and Miss Osei from the Office of Civil Accountability." Ms. Osei didn't smile. She didn't blink much either. "We are opening an internal review regarding an incident that took place last Thursday morning involving Mr. Kenton Moreau." Brent's face went blank. "We've already spoken on that. He was released, case dismissed. Nothing else happened." Granger chimed in. "The investigation goes beyond the arrest." Lynn straightened in her chair. "Excuse me? We're reviewing your history. Complaints, stops, reports filed, and those that were adjusted after the fact." Captain Rolstad shifted in his seat, then slid a manila folder across the desk. "You'll receive subpoenas to appear at the review hearing. 2 weeks. Brent opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Lynn swallowed hard. "Are we being accused of something?" "Not yet," Granger said. "That's what the hearing is for." The next morning, an email landed in both of their inboxes. Subject: Case Review Summary. Prepared by Special Counsel K. Moreau. It had attachments. Lots of them. Old stops. Body cam timestamps. Civilian statements. Things they thought no one would piece together. Brent's hands hovered over his keyboard for a full minute before he could bring himself to click. He opened one file. A stop from 3 years ago. A man named Julian York. Pulled for a broken taillight. Detained for non-compliance. Charges dropped. The body cam footage was listed as not uploaded. The statement from York said he'd been slammed against his car after asking for a supervisor. Brent remembered it. Not clearly, but enough. He closed the file, chest tight. Lynn messaged him. "Lynn, they're going to make this look like a pattern." Brent: "It is a pattern." There was a pause before she replied. "Lynn, we followed protocol." But even she didn't sound sure anymore. Because Kenton wasn't just coming with one story. He was bringing receipts. And Brent and Lynn were finally realizing this wasn't a cleanup. It was an autopsy. The review hearing wasn't held at the precinct or the courthouse. It took place in a neutral municipal building off Fairview Avenue, the kind of space used for zoning meetings and forgotten city business. But this day, every chair in that gray-walled conference room felt electric. Brent Halcroft adjusted his tie 3 times before walking in. Lynn Mercer sat in the hallway, flipping through a thin folder, though she hadn't read a single page in 20 minutes. They weren't alone. At least a dozen people sat around the table, legal observers, a member of the city's ethics board, 2 from the state attorney's office. No uniforms, no familiar faces, no backup. At the head of the table sat Kenton Moreau. He didn't look angry. That would have been easier. He looked prepared. The chair next to him was filled by Ms. Osei, who opened the hearing with a flat voice. This is a formal review under Article 14. Officers Halcroft and Mercer are present. Allegations concern abuse of discretionary authority and repeated misapplication of procedural stops. She turned to Kenton. Special Counsel Moreau, you have the floor. Kenton didn't raise his voice, didn't lean in. He just opened his folder. This won't be about accusations, he said. It'll be about patterns. He placed a document on the table. Case 1, Julian York, stopped for a broken taillight. Detained for over 45 minutes, no charges. Report lacks any body cam footage. Lynn cleared her throat. That was 3 years ago. Kenton didn't even look up. Case 2, Elan Rivers. Matched the description of a robbery suspect. Same precinct, same language used in the report. Also detained without probable cause. No charges. He slid another sheet forward. Case 3. Same officers, same phrasing. Fit the description. Suspicious behavior, non-compliant tone. Brent leaned forward. We respond to calls as they come in. We don't control the descriptions. But you control how long you hold someone, Kenton replied. You control whether you check IDs or ask questions before making assumptions. You control your tone, your language, and the number of times someone with no criminal record walks away with bruises and no apology. He pulled out a printed map, marked with red pins. These are all the stops you two have conducted over the last 5 years. The pins weren't scattered. They formed clusters, on specific streets, in certain neighborhoods. Kenton continued. We compared your stop data to 3 other patrol teams. You average 42% more stops. 80% of those involve individuals from one demographic group. 90% result in no charges. Ms. Osei added quietly. That's not policing. That's profiling. Lynn's voice rose slightly. So what? We're on trial for doing our jobs? Responding to calls, following protocol? You're not on trial, Kenton said, his voice still steady. You're in review. A review triggered because, for once, you stopped the wrong person. Not someone with less credibility, not someone without recourse. Me, he paused. Let the words settle. I wasn't special that day. I didn't carry a badge. I was just a man outside a bakery. You decided that was enough. Brent exhaled through his nose. We had a dispatch. We didn't target you. You didn't have to, Kenton answered. Because you've built a system where the targeting happens automatically. He looked around the room, then back at Brent and Lynn. You can't fix what you won't admit. No one spoke for a long time. The silence didn't feel victorious. It felt surgical. This wasn't revenge, it was exposure. And in that room, every skipped step, every rushed report, every rolled eye over a civilian complaint came back to the surface. Because when you make the same call over and over, it stops being a mistake. It becomes who you are. By the time the second day of the review began, Brent Halcroft was cracking. He came in looking older, eyes dull, jaw clenched, posture tighter than usual. He didn't speak much to Lynn. He barely even looked at her. She was calm, or at least pretending to be. She wore the same defiance she always had, but something about her eyes gave it away. She was scanning the room too much, watching too closely. Kenton Moreau didn't bring fire and brimstone. He brought testimony. One by one, they stepped in. Julian York, the man from the taillight stop, told his story. How he asked for a supervisor and ended up with a sprained wrist. How he filed a complaint that went nowhere. How he never heard a follow-up. Just silence. Elin Rivers, who had been mistaken for a robbery suspect while walking home with a grocery bag, recounted being thrown to the ground in front of his daughter. She hadn't spoken for days afterward. Brent shifted in his seat during that one. There were others. Not everyone showed up, but the ones who didn't shout. They didn't spit accusations. They just told what happened. That made it worse, because Brent and Lynn couldn't poke holes in stories that simple, that human. Lynn crossed her arms tightly. We've seen the worst of people. We can't afford to hesitate when things match up. Kenton didn't respond right away. He looked at her like someone might study a structure before deciding where the fault lines were. Maybe the problem is what you consider a match, he finally said. Brent's voice cracked a little. You don't know what it's like to walk those streets every day. People lie to you, threaten you, run from you. It changes how you read things. Kenton gave a small nod. I don't deny that the job is hard, but when the same kind of face keeps paying for other people's mistakes, it stops being about danger. It starts being about comfort. Comfort? Lynn scoffed. Yes, the comfort of predictable assumptions. The comfort of never being the one on the ground. Brent's shoulders sank, just slightly. Then Ms. Osei opened another folder. 3 reports filed in the past 24 months show evidence of altered body cam footage uploads. One video was labeled corrupted. Another was never submitted at all. Brent looked up, slow and heavy. That's a tech issue. That's not on us. Kenton didn't even flinch. It wasn't on you the first time, or maybe even the second, but now we're on the 4th. For the first time, Lynn didn't have a response. The weight of their reports, footage, patterns, it was starting to press against them in ways they hadn't prepared for. They were always protected, always insulated. But that shield was full of cracks now, and Kenton wasn't swinging a hammer. He was just holding up a light. One of the panel members leaned forward, a former officer herself. Do either of you acknowledge that your methods may have caused harm? Lynn stared at her, then at the table. Then slowly said, We've always done what we were taught. That sentence hung in the air. Kenton spoke low. Then maybe it's time we start teaching something else. Because once you admit the cracks, you can't pretend the wall still holds. The final day of the hearing didn't begin with fireworks. No gavel slam, no raised voices. Just the slow hum of shuffling papers and the quiet tension of people who knew the story was coming to a close. And not everyone would walk out the same. Brent and Lynn sat side by side, still in uniform, but their energy had changed. Brent had stopped defending. He was still, quiet. Lynn kept her arms folded, eyes forward, lips tight. No longer smug, just rigid. Kenton Moreau stood up and walked to the center of the room. He wasn't flanked by anyone. No legal team, no theatrics, just him and a folder. Edges slightly worn from use. He placed it gently on the table. I've said what I needed to say, he began. You've heard from the people affected. You've seen the numbers, the language in the reports, the footage we recovered. You've heard the same phrases repeat, same methods, same faces being stopped, questioned, cuffed, and then quietly released. He glanced at Brent. I don't believe either of you joined this department with bad intentions. But somewhere along the way, you stopped checking yourselves. You stopped seeing people and started seeing profiles. The room stayed silent. I'm not here to ruin your lives. That's not justice. I'm here because the system can't fix itself if it keeps protecting patterns that clearly don't work. He paused and looked toward the review board. My recommendation, he said clearly, is that Officers Halcroft and Mercer be removed from field duty indefinitely, pending further training, psychological review, and a complete departmental audit. I'm also requesting the cases flagged during this review be formally reopened. Brent looked down. Didn't even flinch. He knew it was coming. Lynn whispered under her breath. It was a job. Kenton turned to her. No, it was a responsibility. And when you forget that, people get hurt. The board went into closed session. 35 minutes later, they returned with their verdict. Brent Halcroft, suspended from active duty, stripped of his badge pending reassessment. Lynn Mercer, same. Neither one spoke when the decision was read aloud. Neither fought it. There was no dramatic exit, no slamming chairs, just two officers who had believed for too long that their position protected them from accountability. Kenton gathered his things quietly. On his way out, he passed Brent and paused. Brent looked up at him, just for a second. "I didn't think it would end like this," Brent said. "It didn't have to," Kenton replied, "but that wasn't up to me." He walked away without another word. That evening, Brent packed up his locker alone. Lynn never showed. Rumor was she'd taken personal leave. No one reached out. The same people who once toasted them at retirement parties and year-end banquets were suddenly busy or on call. The precinct was already starting to look over its shoulder. A new poster went up in the hallway near the squad room. Civil Accountability Hotline. Confidential. A few rookies glanced at it longer than necessary. And Kenton? He flew to Coeur d'Alene the next morning. Another city. Another precinct. Another quiet review. That was the job. Not about headlines. About structure. Truth. Long-term repair. He didn't need applause. He just needed the wall to stop hiding the cracks. Because when no one is watching the watchers, the cycle never breaks. But now, someone finally is. 2 months later, the city of Boise was still adjusting. The media had moved on, for the most part. No major protests, no viral headlines. But something had shifted underneath the surface, and the people who paid attention could feel it. Kenton Miro didn't stay. He was never meant to. His job was motion. City to city, case to case, never staying long enough to become part of the story. He wasn't looking for praise or a pedestal. He just wanted consequences to exist for everyone, not just the powerless. But the effect of what happened didn't vanish with him. The training manual at the Boise precinct got rewritten. Not dramatically. Just enough to matter. Officers were now required to review real case footage, not staged examples of stops gone wrong. Kenton's case became one of them. Recruit orientation started asking a new question. Have you ever made a mistake and learned from it? Not to shame, but to see if a person could take accountability before they wore a badge. Brent Halcroft took a job in the city's vehicle impound department. Quiet, unarmed, behind a desk. He didn't talk about the hearing, didn't pretend he'd been wronged. Some said he was bitter. Others said he'd finally started listening. Lynn Mercer never returned. Word was she moved back to Wyoming, closer to her sister. She deactivated her social media, declined all interviews. She didn't argue with the board's findings, but she didn't accept them either, not out loud. And the people who were stopped, cuffed, humiliated without reason, some of them got apologies. Not all, but a few. Julian York received a handwritten letter from the mayor's office. Elin Rivers got a follow-up call from the city attorney asking if he'd be open to mediation. Nothing flashy. No settlements splashed across the news, but quiet signs that something had, in fact, hit a nerve. That was the part most people missed. Justice doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it just means someone finally listens. Someone in power gets asked to answer. And the next time, maybe someone hesitates before treating a man in a navy jacket like a suspect before a person. Because that day outside the bakery could have happened to anyone. But it happened to Kenton Miro, a man who'd spent his entire life watching people get silenced. And when it was his turn, he didn't scream, he didn't threaten. He showed them the mirror, and for once they had to look. The lesson wasn't that Brent and Lynn were evil, or even unusual. The lesson was how easy it is to stop seeing people as people, and how dangerous it becomes when that habit wears a badge. And maybe, just maybe, someone in that precinct, some young recruit with fresh boots and a clean badge, would remember that next time they got a call with a vague description. Maybe they'd pause, ask a question, check an ID before a wrist. maybe that would be enough to change one life, maybe more. Because change doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it just walks out of a courtroom with a folder full of names and makes sure it doesn't happen again. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, if you believe truth should make us uncomfortable enough to grow, subscribe to this channel. Every story is a step toward understanding. Let's not look away when it matters.